She sat beside the poet at the edge of the fountain. She was wearing red plastic heart-shaped sunglasses. She took a sandwich out of her purse and ate it and then continued to sit there beside him, doing nothing. The crowd in the courtyard had begun to thin in one of its periodic lulls, and her nearness, together with her complete disregard of him, began to feel like a strange intimacy. He wondered if she wanted a poem. The poet was grinning, watching a Great Dane linking along behind its human, with its great big sad and faithful look upon its drooping face. He was trying to compose the first line of a poem about the loyalty of dogs when the woman with the red plastic heart-shaped sunglasses held out towards him a tin of individually wrapped candies. He declined, but decided that he would write her a poem. He wrote the dog poem that had been precipitating inside him, and when he had finished it, he held the poem out to her. She took it and held it in her lap. Her cheeks were round and splotched red, and she sat hunched over, looking at the poem. The poet returned to watching the churn of the courtyard, which had begun to fill up again. His eyes caught on a giant bubble drifting up above the outstretched hands of the children, eager for its destruction, and he watched as the bubble floated up and up, rippling now against the blue sky, and then it split along a seam and quickly stripped itself to emptiness. "This is shit," she spoke with a thick Russian accent. He turned to her, still smiling at the bubble's disappearance. "How can you write such shit for people?" She shook her head and handed the poem back to him. A full-body cackling took hold of the poet, a joyous convulsion of laughter. "You are laughing at me. Why are you laughing at me?" "You're right. It's a very bad poem." He crumbled up the paper and dropped it in his bag. "It is shit. I could do better." "Do you write poems?" he asked. "I am not like you. I did not go to school where they teach me I can write poems." They sat together in silence. He looked up at the trees, their buds just beginning to burst into leaf. "Write me another poem," she said to him. "I will see if it is also shit." He took out his pen and wrote out his best poem for her, a poem about trees. It felt wrong to write something he had already written, but he did not want to disappoint her again. He handed her the poem and noticed a little girl about 6 years old who had been waiting for him to finish. She walked up to him, a few dollars held in her hand. "You want a poem?" he asked. The little girl nodded seriously. He leaned down towards her. "What do you want a poem about?" "My family," she said, glancing behind her to where her parents were waiting. They waved. She turned back to him, embarrassed. As he began to write, she tucked the money into his tip jar and then stood a few feet away watching him. When he finished, he handed her the poem and she solemnly nodded at him and ran back to her parents with the poem flapping in her hand. "What the fuck is daned?" the woman beside him asked, gesturing at the poem. "It's when you do something that you think is beneath you, that you think you're too good for? She frowned and nodded and looked back at the poem. A moment later, she asked, "What the fuck is gaze?" "It's when you look at something intently." He widened his eyes and looked at her to demonstrate. She hummed a little disappointed noise of understanding. She took out a pen from her purse and underlined all 8 lines of the poem. "This is good," she said, as if she regretted that it were so. "This is very good poem." Another full-body cackle took over the poet. "You laugh like crazy, man, but you are a good poet." She held the page up. "I can keep this?" "Yes, of course, it's yours." She folded the poem up and put it in her purse. "You do this every day?" "Pretty much. I started about a month ago." "I have not seen you. I come here every day." He shrugged at her. "What do you do?" he asked. "In Russia, I am actress. I come to New York to be actress. But here I cannot be actress because I am ugly." She gestured at her face. "So now I give medical blowjob." "You give what?" "I give blowjob to doctors." "Oh, and I come here to eat my lunch." A man and a woman in expensive-looking black clothes approached him and asked for a poem about New York City. He wrote the poem, and the woman took it, and the couple leaned in together to read it. The woman said it was great, and the man handed him a $10 bill. The Russian held out her hand and said, "Can I read a poem?" The woman hesitantly held out the page, and the Russian took it and mumbled the lines out loud to herself. She turned to the poet and brandished the poem at him. "This is shit." She turned to the couple. "You like this shit?" The woman was flustered. I thought it was nice." She looked to the poet and then back to the Russian. "We're just visiting." The Russian shook her head in disgust and handed the poem back to her. "You should not pay for shit poem. Give them money back." She gestured at the poet. The poet smiled and took out the $10 bill and held it out to the couple. The woman said, No, it's yours." The poet gave them a little seated bow and pocketed the bill. The couple quickly walked off. "People pay you for shit poems?" He explained that most people just wanted souvenirs and often paid him before they even read the poem. She shook her head in disgust. They sat for a few minutes watching the crowds, and then the poet said that he was going to walk around and write poems. "I will come with you." He stood up and adjusted his sandwich board sign and went off walking around the courtyard. The Russian followed a few steps behind him. He walked past the men with snakes, past the crowd of children circling the bubble man, past the old man sitting on a little stool playing a one-string zither. A man in a business suit came up and asked for a poem. "For my wife," he said. "She loves poems." He handed the poet a $5 bill. The poet stood writing against his clipboard, and the Russian stood nearby watching him. He gave the poem to the man, who read it. "It's a little over my head," he said with a smile, "but I'm sure my wife will like it." The Russian asked to see the poem. A scowl flickered across the man's face, but then he smiled and handed the poem to her. She read it and said to him, "This is very good poem. You are idiot." She handed the poem back to the man, who looked at the poet. The poet raised his eyebrows and shrugged. The man walked off, scowling. Maybe try not to insult the customers. How do I insult him? He is idiot. He does not know he is idiot. The poet smiled and they set off wandering again around the courtyard. The Russian was not good for business. She'd ask to read every poem he wrote and then announce whether it was shit or good. Sometimes she scoffed at people's poem requests. Sometimes she scared people off before they had paid. But to the poet, the bluntness of her honesty seemed irreproachable, and her assessment of the poems was, he thought, almost always correct. Another hour passed, and the evening was steeping the sky with blue ink, and instead of lingering in the courtyard, people started to just pass through. It was time to head home. The poet said goodbye to the Russian. He offered her some of the money he had made. She scowled at him and shook her head. Maybe I see you here again. He put away his sign and his clipboard and joined the flow of anonymous New Yorkers exiting the park. He walked down the path lined with towering elms and looked up at their limbs spreading above him, catching the last of the light.